It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome Mathilde Fasting to the podcast. She is a Norwegian economist, historian of ideas. She works at the Norwegian-based think tank Civita and an author of books about Norwegian political and economic history. And today we are going to be discussing her latest book titled After the End of History, Conversations with Francis Fukuyama. It's very nice to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for making me come to the podcast in so long distance geographically. I'm in Oslo and you are in Vietnam, and that's quite a lot, but we have managed to do that. So thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
Yeah, I hope the internet connection is favorable because I've had several occasions where, the feed just sort of like pops out and, the internet is not that stable, but hope this is good. Okay, so let's begin by asking, so explain to us what a think tank is and what is someone who works at a think tank do.
Well, a think tank is something in between, I would say, people working in a university, academic life, and also people working in politics. So it's something in between. It's kind of an institute where you are not dependent neither on universities or academic institutions or political parties. So our think tank is we have a political um, goal, so to say. We are a liberal think tank, and that kind of contains a lot of different things. So you can be, you can argue for many different liberal things, but you don't need to agree with any political party. You can argue for the sake of the argument and not for something that's supposed to be politics of some kind. But of course, we are closer to politics than to universities and to academic life. So I would say that our goal is to contribute to have arguments about liberalism and all kinds of politics that we find valuable in that regard, and try to have meetings, doing podcasts like you do, writing articles, even books and papers, trying to sometimes just explain things, and other times taking a position and maybe suggest new politics. And then it's up to the political parties and to journalists and to anybody to pick them up and to act upon them. So that is what we do. And I'm myself have an academic background. So as you said, I'm an economist and also a historian of ideas. And all my colleagues, they have different academic backgrounds, but they could be like in philosophy, in history, it could be in economics, it could be in different kinds of even in law. My colleagues, they have a wide range of educations and backgrounds, and some of them are even working part-time with us and then full-time at universities. So it's really a mix of people that could come and work
Gotcha.
for a think tank.
Yeah. So how did you first got interested in the works of, well, our subject of this discussion, Dr. Francis Fukuyama, and how did you encounter his ideas first and then, well, the man himself?
Yeah, I actually started, I'm not a trained political scientist myself, but as I said, I'm an historian of ideas. And in that regard, you have a lot of politics and ideas of politics up through history. So in 2011, I found his book, the Origins of Political Order, which is a
Mhm.
huge volume about politics and how that came to be. And I thought that this is a really interesting book, and I read it eagerly about that time, 2011. And I also saw that he was going to publish another volume which came in 2014, so Political Order and Political Decay, and I started reading that as well. And then I started reflecting on what is his idea of a sound political system, and I came to the conclusion, as he does also in his book, that he says getting to Denmark. And Denmark is our neighboring country. And I thought, okay, if he says getting to Denmark, why doesn't he say getting to Norway? It's more or less the same thing. We are both Scandinavian countries, and our political systems, they are really more or less the same. And as you might know, Denmark and Norway, we were in a union for about 400 years up until 1814. So really, it is part of the same history for many, many centuries. So then I thought, this man here, he's talking about some very important things that can explain how liberal democracies have come to exist, and all other political systems as well. And I then gradually thought about writing something for the Norwegian public about his ideas of what is a liberal democracy, and how has this evolved through the centuries, and why have we in Norway become a liberal democracy. So that was my starting point. And then I read his book, The End of History. That is his first book, the book that came in 1992, and that started with his article in 1989 with the same title. It wasn't a short article, but it became really well. He became famous by that article, and he then explained about the ideas of liberal democracy, and that was before the wall of Berlin came down. So it was kind of provocative at that point. And that finally led to me contacting Francis Fukuyama and asking him if he would be willing to talk to me about all these ideas of political order and liberal democracies and so forth. And he agreed. So that's the long, short story for how it came to be.
Yes. So just a follow-up question. So what does Dr. Fukuyama finds in, well, the Norwegian political economic system that, well, appeals to you as a Norwegian? Because here's the thing, I follow American politics a lot, and the the majority of the time that countries like Norway mention, it is in the context of, well, Scandinavian countries, and they are often uttered by the more socialist left of the American political spectrum. You got your Bernie Sanders and such. They always say that, well, that is the model of the kind of socialism that we are pursuing. And again, I may be a bit ignorant about how the Norwegian economy works, but I know that they are not socialists. So yeah, so what is
No,
again, back to the question.
that's true. I think it's what he says is actually, you have, at least for him to define liberal democracy, that's important first. It's having a rule of law, and also having democratic accountability, elections and so forth. And then finally having a sound bureaucracy, to put it short. So it means that you have a neutral and independent bureaucracy that works on behalf of the state, and together with the rule of law and the democratic accountability, those pillars are the pillars of liberal democracy. And they can come in many different versions, but those three are the most important things that need to be in place. But I mean, you can say that the United States is a liberal democracy, whereas Norway is, and you just mentioned the differences between those two political systems, even though we are both liberal democracies by that definition. So, but Norway is, when it says socialist, and when you're thinking about Bernie Sanders looking at Norway and saying that, oh, that's a socialist country, it's not really true, because it's true that we have, for many years, we have had a big Labour Party, and the Labour Party in Norway is a social democratic party. And we've also had a big conservative party, which you could compare to like the CDU in Germany, for instance. So, and both of them have been, well, more or less dominant during the last century, even though we have a parliamentary system that also contains many other smaller political parties. So it's not a dual kind of thing. It's we have 8 political parties at the moment that are over the threshold of 4%. So they are all represented in the parliament, and that means that that power has kind of been transferred to and for between those two blocks, if you would say so, but not as you would find it in the UK or in the United States. And that's important because the conservative part of that political party, they have been much more liberal in the sense that I would call liberal in the more European sense. So not liberal in the very socialist left-leaning sense of the United States, but liberal in the European sense. And I would say that now, over time, the Social Democratic Party has accepted more the market economy, more the liberal ideas, whereas the conservative side or the liberal side, they have accepted that we need to have a qualified and competent state, and that is also what Fukuyama uses. He uses the word competent state.
Oh.
And when I asked him about a competent state, I said, "What is that?" And he said that could be very different in different countries. It depends on what kind of services and what kind of ideas that you think that the state should provide you with. And in Norway, we have found out, okay, it's nice to have healthcare system publicly, more or less. You have, for instance, in used example of Israel, they have put a lot of resources into military because that is what they have the security issue. And you can say that has not been the priority up until now for Norwegians, more or less to do that as a main focus. But then that gradually develops. And the most important thing for him when he says competent is that you trust the state and you trust the public services and you trust them to do the best for the people. So that is probably why some Americans think that we are socialist, because of this idea of the state.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we'll return to this idea of the competent state in a bit in the context of COVID-19. I actually read that Foreign Affairs article that he wrote in 2020. But let's begin by that phrase that Dr. Fukuyama is best known for, and the ones that people use to kind of dismiss him whenever you listen to Francis Fukuyama. The people who do not read him well closely would say, "Oh, well, he's the end of history guy." Of course, it's a phrase that is, I think it was first attributed to Hegel, who believes that history follows a linear progress that sort of move forward and upward. And in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and all signs points to the end of Soviet communism, Fukuyama penned that article titled "The End of History?" And he proclaims the triumph of liberal democracy, at least over communism and other universal ideals. And 3 years later, of course, in 1992, he wrote that book that made him a household name, often, not for the best of reasons, "The End of History" and "The Last Man." That is, even he himself acknowledged that people misses the last man part of the argument. Of course, that is a phrase attributed to Friedrich Nietzsche, another German philosopher. As far as I can tell, reading from Nietzsche, it means that a man without ideals who still has, who wants to have an ideals, but is want of something to fight for. So, and in a sense, Fukuyama's Last Man is a warning to liberal democracy in the future, in that this may be the final stage in the political evolution of political order. And so those who are living in liberal democracies will find themselves with nothing else to look forward to. Would that be a correct analysis?
Yes, absolutely. I would agree, because it's very important, two things that you said. The first thing that you said is that he put a question mark to the end of history. And that's important because, I mean, he doesn't say, and that's probably why he has been criticized and why people still use that phrase to just tell that he's naive, or that's not, how could you say that liberal democracy will be the preferred system all over the world, and that's not the case. So what he's saying is that so far, and even he does repeat that now, 20, 30 years later, liberal democracy is probably, until anybody comes up with a better idea, the best idea that we have ever found for political order and political systems. So he says that this is a system that has come to be, not by any plan, but it's turned out to be viable. It's turned out to be a system where freedom of the individual and respect of the individual is best contained. So that is a very important idea. Of course, it is also, if you look at it empirically, you find that liberal democracies, for economic reasons, and they have been having economic growth, and all those kind of things that you could also put onto it. But that's not. I mean, that could also happen to other political systems, that they will be able to have economic growth and so forth. But he says the important thing is the respect, and also the respect of freedom for everyone in that political system, both by enfranchising them and both by respecting and having the rule of law that treats people equally. And when it comes to Nietzsche, he adds that, because that's also important in Nietzsche's thinking. And he's a pessimist, Nietzsche, but he says, and the idea that Fukuyama took from him was that you're correct. If you become complacent, if you have a liberal democracy and you have nothing more to fight for, there's no wars, there's no conflicts, of big conflicts. Of course, you could always create smaller conflicts, and you'll try to put your energy into that. But it's he says that people have, at least some people will have an urge to compete in some sort of sense, to have something to strive for. And when he says that if you have kind of reached your goal, what shall you do? Where shall you go now? What shall you look at? And then it can deteriorate. And that's why liberal democracies can become more autocratic. They can become what Viktor Orban has said, a illiberal democracy, still keeping the democracy part, but not the liberal part. And I think that is something that Fukuyama saw already in 1992, and that he's repeated now in his new book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, that came just a month ago.
Yes.
So you're right. But yeah, it's very important to underline, and he does it all the time, and he's even tired of it. He says it's to say that the idea of liberal democracy as a goal, or as an ideal political system, that is much more important than saying that all countries would be liberal democracies at some point.
Yes.
But you have to come up with something better. You have to come up with we have to prove yourself to have a political system that will perform even better than the liberal democracies over time.
Yeah. About
that hasn't happened.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Yes. So far, I'm skeptical of whether or not a better system than, well, liberal democracy can be came up with, probably after our lifetimes. But so far, I believe 2/3 of the world are living under either an illiberal regime or an undemocratic regime, or a combination of both. And they are all, or at least certain factions of those countries, are leading or campaigning towards liberal democracy. Meanwhile, countries that are both liberal and democratic, they're actually taken several steps back, whether they are inching towards populism or autocracy. And that, of course, is something we are going to discuss shortly. But I believe that Fukuyama sort of changed his mind about his initial optimism 10 years later. He wrote an essay sort of like challenging his own premise of the end of history. But one of the other things that Fukuyama changes his mind on, and it is a point of curiosity for me, is his associations with the American political neoconservatives. And a working definition of what neoconservative mean is required. He initially supported this project known as the Project for the New American Century, um, brought to life by Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan, both neoconservatives. But I think after the war in Iraq and the failure that it brought, Fukuyama started distancing himself from that gang. So what was the appeal of the neoconservatives to Fukuyama, and did he got disillusioned by them?
I think what he explained to me is, first of all, he says, or at least he could argue that it's not true, but he says that he didn't feel that it was a neoconservative movement at any point. But he was, I think, during his youth. Also, you can say he grew up and he was at the university in 1968 with the flower power and hippies and things, and he also came in contact with French philosophy. He went to Paris, and he didn't like that, so he came back and he decided to do a PhD with Samuel Huntington at Harvard, and then I think his ideas were aligned more, or were more in line with the more conservative movement. And actually he is at some point not, I would say, culturally conservative, but he has some conservative ideas, and I think that was his reasons for agreeing with them. But he very shortly and quite quickly, after working a bit in foreign policies for the US, he was stationed in Europe, in different countries for a substantial period of time, and he was also visiting Germany and Berlin right before the wall came, and he was in Europe that spring and summer before the wall came down. So then he, I think he saw, and I think that the drop that finally made him change his views considerably and really saying this is not the case was, as you mentioned, the war in Iraq. It was the position that Bush took and what they did there, and he actually says in the book, in my interviews, that he didn't agree, but he doesn't know even now if the paper that he wrote was ever read by the people that should have read it, because he said we cannot just defeat them and then do nothing. And that when that came in and really sunk into him, he said then the question of how you could create institutions that could be viable in that country that you go in, and you take out Saddam, but what do you do after that? And he saw that was just a big failure, and he disagreed very much with the US foreign policy at that time, and he changed his views. And as you said, he wrote an article and even a book a couple of years later where he broke with his earlier friends. Some of them he has found back to by now, and some of them not. But
Yes.
as friends, I mean, personal friends, not us. I mean, his ideas are his ideas now, and it's not, I mean, you cannot say he's gone back to the neoconservatives in any sense. So just that he said that personally that period of time for him in the beginning of the 2000s, it was difficult for him personally because he kind of broke with them and they became angry, and it was an unpleasant situation.
Yes. I believe his is probably the most compelling critique of neoconservatism that I've read, because even today, when the war in Ukraine was going on, I mean, I can still hear like ideologues from the far left to the far right of the U.S. political spectrum, raising alarm bells about how the neoconservatives in the U.S. government are, are influencing the president to intervene. And I thought, ever since Trump happened, well, the neoconservatives are basically out of power. I mean, William Kristol, probably the sort of like the head of the neoconservatives in the 90s and 2000s, is basically kind of a anti-Republican reactionary at this point. And I do think that one of the central mistakes that the Bush era, as well as the neoconservatives, at least in the realm of foreign policy, makes is that they pay perhaps too much attention to fostering democracy abroad, where it's in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where uh, the people, as well as the leadership class, has never known democracy. And so a viable liberal democratic state cannot be brought in from scratch, and especially as a foreign Western import.
Yeah, that's true. So I could do a parallel for you there because I mean, as you said, you mentioned Afghanistan and you mentioned Iraq, and
Mhm.
then and I mean Fukuyama, he opposed that as we just discussed. But then when we're talking about Ukraine, what has Fukuyama done? He has been head of a leadership program and a democracy program at Stanford and cooperating with Ukrainians all the way since 2014, which means that he has been visiting Ukraine many times and Ukrainians have come to do courses at Stanford and so forth. And that has become a quite big community of not only scholars but leaders and people interested in building institutions in Ukraine and so forth. So he has kind of, I think, tried to do what he has argued that was important. Really going to the country, engage people and trying to help them create institutions and then democratic institutions, because he has seen that if you don't have that inside the country, or if you don't have it, the people in the country, if they don't know what to do, things will not succeed. And as we also saw in the Arab Spring, there were no one. That was a huge protest and many things happened, but I mean there were nobody there afterwards to take up the threads and building what's the most, well, the most important but also the most difficult thing, to build the institutions that keep the society together, and that works. And that, as we just said, for liberal democracies, those institutions are paramount. They are really important to have in place, and that's not done, as you said, just by taking out the leader of a country, or I mean, or that's not, then it's not going to happen if you don't have people on the ground organizing themselves in viable ways.
Mhm. And another mistake of the American neoconservatives is obviously they did not foresee the uh, growing or fermenting tide of populism at home in the US. I mean, some of them even enabled it when, I mean, the Weekly Standard, Bill Kristol's magazine, really supported uh, adding Sarah Palin as the running mate to John McCain in the 2008 election. And Sarah Palin was herself like a really full-throated populist. She basically laid the red carpet for the other populist, Donald J. Trump. So let's talk about populism. I mean, if you read the news of the world, populism seems to be rising, but one of the few, I guess, good things, may I say it, about the Russia-Ukraine conflict is that it reveals that these populists, left and right alike, are really bankrupt in their ideas. And they are
Yeah.
really anti-democratic and such. Yes, please.
Yes, yeah, that is, I mean, in during the interviews and in the book with when the after the end of history discussions with Francis Fukuyama, and also in his book Identity that came in 2018. I mean, that one that came in 2018 was just a direct result of the election of Donald Trump in the United States. And one of his main concerns there is, of course, populism, because he says that this is just very damaging to the political system. Not that, I mean, that people can be populist in a certain sense, but because he says people will always, and political parties will always, try to simplify their messages and trying to create the main differences between themselves and other political parties, for instance. That's okay. That's how politics works in a sense. So as long as you keep it in there, that's okay. So if you call that populism, that's the populism that you will see in politics, where you have different political parties. So he's not opposed to that as a principle, but when it comes to become a problem like it has done here, it goes on with identity politics, which means that the politics and the populism takes on measures to identify people looking, well, I mean, wouldn't say red hairs or black hairs or something. You mean, I mean, things that you cannot do anything with. I mean, if you're born in that country, and if you, I mean, you are what you are in a certain sense. But populists, they try to identify people to create groups, sometimes based on ideas, but it can be on ethnicity, like Viktor Orban does in Hungary, telling people that they have to be real Hungarians. And then you can say, what are real Hungarians? Well, if you're not born in Hungary, if your grandfather's not born there, or whatever it is, he is the one that decides. And that is the dangerous, one of the dangerous ways of populism that Francis Fukuyama is really afraid of, and that he is writing about. And the trouble is also that you have populists leaders, and what they do, and that's well known, of course, that they create special bond between themselves and their voters, or between themselves and what they consider as being the people. And then, as I just said, the people could be not necessarily the people living within a national border, but it could be a group of people based on certain characteristics, and that's dangerous. And you find populists, as you also said, on the left and on the right. And on the left, you have populists trying to buy people with proposing easy, understandable economic benefits. That could be one way. And you have the right-wing populists that he is most afraid of, Fukuyama, because he says they usually go on and defining themselves in some sort of identitarian way that could be very, very dangerous for a society. And that's what happened with Donald Trump in the United States.
Yes, and I can see that how Fukuyama seems to be a lot more worried about the right-wing strain of identity politics, because they tend to be more nativist, and most importantly, they tend to get their leaders in governments. I mean, the Brexiteers definitely get Boris Johnson in, and of course, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and of course, Donald Trump in the US. I wonder if, I think he is concerned as well about the left-wing version of identity politics, which I find myself a lot more worried about, because the left-wing version of identity politics, even though their leaders may not get into government, they can actually influence the culture and to be a lot more, well, hostile and dicey to even conduct discussions of anything. Of course, the right-wing version of identity politics is nativist and nationalist, whereas the left-wing identity politics, as far as I can tell, relies on human categories of race and gender, and, well, sexual minorities and such. So, so what is?
Yeah, and actually, yes, Fukuyama actually explains that, because he says that originally this type of identification, as we're talking about the group identification, and any kind of you have to define the group, and you can do that in different ways. And he says that this originally started out on the left side of politics, as you just mentioned. Black Lives Matter, and I mean, it could be different in different countries, but it has to do, as you said, with gender, race, and so forth. And they were, of course, legitimate, because people were suffering, people were having trouble, and it was absolutely, could say that why shouldn't they have these rights, and why shouldn't we take into account that they have suffered troubles and so forth, and give them special treatments, in a way, if you could say special treatments or rights or anything that could help their situation becoming better. And I mean, that could, of course, be justified in many senses. But when that comes up to a level of in politics and then transferred quickly over to the other side of the horseshoe, to the right of populists, they will take that up and do, as you said, defining the same kind of thing as a nationalist, often conservative way that will define people in the same way, and saying that people and the people will be then defined also very carefully of the right wing. But what he says is that the idea originally transferred from one side of politics to the other. And as you just said, populists on the right side, right wing side, they have become like Donald Trump president. So they have political power in a sense. That of course you can also say about left wingers, but not the same, not as we have said in the United States. As for now, there are movements on the left side, but it was the right side that took the presidency with Trump.
Yes. I think it of course affects Western countries' policies towards the pandemic, COVID-19, which hopefully we're seeing the end of. So this brings back the idea of the competent state, as quoted by Fukuyama. The way I see it, I lived in Canada when the pandemic happened. I was studying there, and it seems that there is simultaneously too much state action as interference, as well as not enough state interference, in that countries which have like pretty first-class healthcare systems have utterly failed to prevent the pandemic from spreading across their populations. And the too much part comes in what I find to be extensive lockdown rules and certain mask and vaccine mandates, which in Canada, I've seen a lot of people protesting, and the populists themselves have leaned on this anti-mandate stuff to elevate their political platforms. And so what does Fukuyama mean when he says a competent state? Because as he have said it, well, we in the Western world, especially in America, argues about whether we should have a small or a large state. And of course, I think he also says we should look to Norway as a model for a competent state. So what does that mean?
Well, as I said, he's not talking much about size, because it could be big and it could be smaller, and in any sense you have to tune that into the needs that you need to cover. But the competence comes into, I think, first of all, we could go a step back and say that in order to make a competent state work, you need to have trust, because trust makes things work much more easily, because if you don't have that underlying trust between the citizens and the state and the bureaucracy of the state, that will have to be the ones that are actually doing the job, like getting vaccines, and in the pandemic sense, they were the ones that you had to trust that people will do what was correct and right to do without corruption and without, the supplies should be secure, and you would have to believe that supplies of masks or vaccines or anything that will be taken care of. So that is the practical part of it. And I think that, as you said, you could have a competent public health system, or you could have a competent health system, but you need the people in the country to believe that they will get treatment. You need to have that trust. So he talks about trust. That's important for a competent state. And then a competent state, needs to be anti corruption. That's very important. So a state where you will find corruption is not good. That's not a competent state. Mm-hmm. And there are many other pitfalls that you could go into, and countries will do that in a more or in a bigger or smaller sense. And also he says, and in the pandemic situation, I think that he saw that, and that's a little curious, and it revealed some differences between, for instance, Norway and Sweden, and Norway and Denmark. And we will, to you, be just a little block of Scandinavian countries, and they are all alike. But during the pandemic and during the start, we saw that Denmark and Norway did the same. They had the same policy. So they kind of had the lockdowns. They had the more or less the same set of rules and so forth, whereas Sweden just kept open.
Mm.
So they had another strategy. That was revealed quickly because the deaths, they were just rising enormously in Sweden and not in Denmark and Norway. And after a year or so, the Swedes came to adapt more to the Norwegian and Swedish, no, sorry, the Norwegian and then Danish policies when it came to rules for how people could move and so forth. So, but then again, as you say, it is a dilemma between enforcing rules like the state had to do or did, maybe not had to do, but did during the pandemics, and the freedom of people and the idea of a liberal society and liberal democracy. Because then you would say, how could you make people stay inside, not being able to visit and so forth, not having people, even visitors at home and so forth, many strict rules. And could you, for instance, say that that vaccines should be mandatory, that you should have to, that, and there were also talks about the vaccine passes that you could use and so forth. So many discussions took place here in Norway and also in many other countries around these issues. But more or less, I think that when it comes to a liberal democracy, I believe that in a situation of crisis like the pandemic was, you could, as a citizen, accept an enforcement of movement or anything that could prevent the pandemic to spread out. But of course, you had to believe, or we had to believe in Norway, for instance, here, what the bureaucrats said and how the politicians acted upon the advice from bureaucracy and from health and from the public health ministry and so forth. So that's why I think we finally came out on the other side of the pandemic with a competent state and with a very, very, very low death rate. So we were actually succeeding. But again, the last thing that a competent state would do, and that we have also done in Norway, is that we have evaluated all the different responses and seen, was this right to do? Could it have been done better? What shall we do to prepare for the next pandemic and so forth? So I wouldn't say, and that's also probably a very important thing for a liberal democracy to work, is that you have a critical debate and you have, like I said, there were these three pillars, and the fourth pillar is the free and the free media and the right to speak up and criticize. That's been done now, and the reports after the pandemic, they have come out, and there are lots of things to criticize. But as long as we believe as citizens that, okay, when this critique comes, we still believe that our competent state will take that into account and act better next time.
Yes. I believe he names Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher to be the two driving forces behind, I guess, distrust in the state as a political position. But nevertheless, I believe how the really bad interventions by the state during COVID-19 is due to the fact that the leaders themselves are not that trustworthy. Neither is the state, because again, in the US, you have Donald Trump, and in the UK, you have Boris, and they do not strike you as trustworthy. Maybe Reagan is a lot. Reagan, if the pandemic happened in Reagan's time, and Reagan tells people to stay indoors for a few weeks, chances are more people would gravitate towards him since he's quite popular. That's just my presumption.
I think you're right.
So Francis Fukuyama's latest book is called Liberalism and Its Discontents. And in it, he mentions the phenomenon, at least in the US, known as post-liberalism. The people who advocate for it are not well, full-throated political activists or advocates. They are actually intellectuals. You can find them in universities and think tanks. Um, he names a few names, Sorab Amari or Yoram Hazoni, who argues that illiberalism has failed and it's time to try something different. So, of course, Francis Fukuyama finds himself in opposition to these people. So perhaps, again, because I'm mindful of our time that we've had, let's end this discussion by saying, so what is Fukuyama's case for liberal democracy as a whole? Well, until we wait for another better system to come about.
Well, first of all, I don't think we should wait for that, because liberal democracy is what we have, or what he believes is the best system, or the least bad one, I should probably say also, because what he says, that to make liberal democracies work, you have to work for it all the time. You have to fight for it, actually. And as we said with the Nietzsche quote, "The last men should be fighting for liberal democracy because it's worth fighting for." And it's not to take in, you cannot take liberal democracy as something that has been established and then will never go away and always function. On the contrary, it can go, as you just described, can go backwards. It can become more authoritarian, and usually it's more illiberal, because it's a fact that people, even in countries that are not liberal, they kind of use the word democracy, and many countries, without being really democratic, put up elections in some kind of way, just to have an illusion and an idea of democracy. So the democracy part, as long as you could control the outcome of elections, you would try to keep that. So he's not so concerned about democracy. He says, of course, that you cannot believe that Russia is a democracy, even if there are elections there, because you know the result before the elections take place. And that is also the case for many other countries. But the liberal part is important, and that comes into the institutions, and it could be many things that can make them become less liberal. And we haven't talked about Poland, or we said something about Hungary, but first step is usually to try to block free speech, try to block criticism, and try to block medias and journalists and people writing about things that can be really unpleasant to hear for politicians and for presidents. But if you try to do that, that's the first thing you can do. The other thing is that, of course, you could try to make rule of law, or even now the courts and the judges, become dependent on you. You could change rules for elections, you could change rules in parliament, and so forth. So there's lots of things that you can do in order to make a society become more illiberal. And that is the fight that people will have to take if they want to keep up the liberal democracy. They have to look at all those small details and speak out, make arguments, engage in politics, and so forth. So what he's come to say, and I completely agree, is that we have been maybe complacent, at least in the decade and maybe two after the Berlin Wall, because we've thought that, okay, communism was out, but it's not. And authoritarian ideas are not out. They are there, and we could see countries all over the world applying many different political systems that you, as a liberal, at least as for me, I would not like to live under. So it's a struggle, and we'll have to accept and acknowledge that is worth fighting for. And I guess that is also his last words in his last book, The Liberalism and His Discontents. Yes. So I think I'll just stick to agreeing with him there.
Yes, it's ironic that Viktor Orban in the 80s and 90s was a very fierce anti-communist, activist, and perhaps he's traded one form of tyranny to another, and that is too bad. But nevertheless, thank you very much, Mathilde Fasting, for being on this program. Thank you for an enlightening and lively discussion on one of the greatest living political theorists and commentator of our time. I wish you all the best of luck in your future endeavors and take care of yourself.
Thank you so much for having me.